After my husband died, his kids said, "We want the estate, the business, everything." My lawyer begged me to fight. I said, "Give it all to them." Everyone thought I had lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed the papers. The kids smiled until their lawyer turned pale when he read the final clause. I sat perfectly still in my charcoal suit. Julian leaned back with a predator's grin. He thought he finally owned me. The courtroom air felt heavy and stagnant. The oak table felt cold beneath my palms. Julian tapped a gold pen against the mahogany surface. It was a rhythmic, annoying sound of victory. His sister, Claire, adjusted her pearls with a trembling hand. They looked at me like I was a ghost. Marcus leaned in and whispered one last plea for sanity. I ignored him and focused on the dust motes dancing in the light. My husband had built a kingdom of secrets. Now, his children were reaching for the crown. I took the fountain pen and scratched my name across the heavy vellum. The ink bled slightly into the fibers like a fresh bruise. Julian snatched the document before the judge could speak. He traded a triumphant look with Claire. They were already spending the dividends in their heads. I felt a strange lightness in my chest as the weight shifted. The judge watched me with a look of profound pity. He did not see the trapdoor opening beneath the Heirs' expensive shoes. Their attorney, Mr. Thorne, finally pulled the papers toward his chest. He adjusted his glasses and began a silent, professional scan. Julian was already texting his broker under the table. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioner. Suddenly, Thorne stopped breathing. His finger froze on a single line of text near the bottom. His face drained of all color until he looked like parchment. He looked up at me with raw terror in his eyes. Thorne cleared his throat, but the sound died in his dry chest. He leaned over and whispered a sharp warning to Julian. The boy's arrogant smile flickered, and then died completely. I stood up slowly and straightened my jacket. The estate came with a massive, undisclosed environmental liability. They had not just inherited the assets. They had personally guaranteed $40 million in immediate, unpayable debt. The legal walls were closing in on them. I watched Julian's hand start to shake. I walked toward the exit without looking back at the carnage. Marcus followed me into the bright afternoon sun. He finally understood why I had surrendered so easily. Behind us, the siblings began to scream at their lawyer. The luxury cars in the lot were no longer theirs to keep. I whistled for my dog and opened the door to my modest sedan. I had traded a gilded cage for a clean horizon. The engine hummed as I drove away from their ruin. The cool air of the parking lot felt like a sharp benediction. Marcus kept pace with me, his leather shoes clicking against the asphalt. He looked at me with a mixture of awe and dawning horror. Behind us, the courthouse glass doors rattled with the force of Julian's rage. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My objective was simple: disappear before the process servers arrived for the heirs. The game had only just begun for them. Marcus grabbed the car door before I could swing it shut. He was breathing hard. "Cheyenne, you knew about the toxic runoff under the refinery site." I nodded slowly as I gripped the steering wheel. My husband had buried the reports, but I had found them months ago. By demanding the business, the kids had accepted the environmental cleanup costs. Julian was now legally tied to a disaster that would bleed him dry. His inheritance was a poison. Suddenly, a black SUV lurched across the lot, blocking my exit path. Julian scrambled out, his face a mottled shade of purple. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. Thorne followed him, clutching the signed papers like a death warrant. The siblings had realized the math didn't add up. They were desperate to undo the damage I had caused with a pen. Julian slammed his fist against my hood. "You trapped us, you bitch!" Julian screamed through the glass. I rolled the window down just an inch to let the heat in. The subtext of our marriage was finally out in the open. I was never the trophy wife they mocked at dinner. I was the one who had kept the inspectors at bay. Without my personal shell companies, the liability had nowhere else to go. It landed squarely on the new owners. Julian's eyes were wild with fear. Thorne leaned over Julian's shoulder, his voice frantic and low. What can argue fraudulent concealment? Cheyenne. I smiled at the lawyer because I had already planned for that move. The files I left in the safe contained every disclosure they needed. They had simply been too greedy to read the fine print before signing. Greed is a powerful anesthetic for the brain. They had waived their right to further discovery in the final hearing. They were stuck. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small digital recorder. I had captured their earlier insults and their frantic demands for the assets. It was proof they had entered the agreement with aggressive intent. Julian backed away from the car as if the device were a bomb. The power balance had shifted entirely in 10 minutes. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the architect of their total financial ruin. They had nothing left to bargain. A second black car pulled into the lot, bearing the logo of the Environmental Protection Agency. I had called them an hour before the hearing began. The agent stepped out with heavy clipboards and stern expressions. They weren't there for me. They were looking for the current legal owners of the refinery. Julian turned to run, but Thorne held him firmly by the arm. The trap was finally closed. I shifted the car into reverse and drove away. The rearview mirror showed Julian shrinking into a frantic speck against the courthouse marble. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my heart hammered a frantic rhythm. I needed to reach the secondary office before the siblings froze the remaining operational accounts. The engine purred as I navigated the narrow streets toward the industrial district. Every stoplight felt like a ticking clock. I had 30 minutes before the news of the environmental suit hit the local wires. The industrial park was a maze of rusted, corrugated steel and gray pavement. I parked behind a stack of weathered shipping crates to stay hidden. The secondary office was a modest brick box that my husband rarely visited. It held the server that managed my private consulting firm. If Julian realized I had moved the client lists, he would claim theft. I hurried to the door with my key clutched tight. The heavy lock clicked open. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and ozone. I sat at the lone desk and flipped the power switch on the server. The screen glowed, casting blue light across my tired face. I began the final data migration to the cloud. A progress bar crawled across the monitor at an agonizing pace. This was the only bridge to my future. If I lost these contacts, the victory at the courthouse would be a hollow one. A heavy thud echoed from the front of the building. My blood ran cold as the handle rattled violently. Julian had found the address faster than I expected. He was screaming my name through the thick metal door. I checked the progress bar 60%. There was no way to hide the car now. I stood up and moved to the window. Two of Julian's hired security guards were trying to pry the frame open. Open the door. Cheyenne, Julian roared. His voice was distorted by the metal, sounding like a wounded beast. I didn't answer him. I walked back to the computer and pulled the master drive. The migration was only at 80%, but I couldn't wait. The window glass shattered with a sharp, crystalline explosion. I ducked behind the desk as shards rained down. I shoved the drive into my pocket. They were coming inside the office. I moved toward the back exit, slipping through the shadows of the storage room. I heard Julian's boots crunching on the broken glass. He sounded frantic, searching for the server that held his last hope for leverage. I stepped out into the humid air of the loading dock. A familiar car was waiting at the curb with the engine running. Marcus sat behind the wheel, his expression grim. I jumped in before the door even settled. "He knows about the consulting firm," Marcus said. He shifted into gear and sped toward the highway. I looked at the drive in my hand. It was the only thing I had saved from the wreckage of the marriage. But Marcus wasn't looking at the road anymore. He was staring at the tablet mounted on the dashboard. A notification flashed in red. The bank had just flagged my personal accounts for suspicious activity. Julian had made his first counter move. I realized he must have used his position as the new legal head of the estate to flag any accounts linked to Robert's name. I gripped the door handle as Marcus swerved onto the expressway. The red warning on the tablet screen pulsed like a heartbeat. Julian had filed a temporary restraining order against my personal assets. He claimed they were commingled with the estate funds. My objective now was to reach the local credit union before the digital freeze synchronized. I needed liquid cash to survive the coming litigation. The city skyline blurred into a gray streak of concrete and steel. The credit union was a small, quiet branch tucked inside a grocery store. It was my secret reserve, opened years ago under my maiden name. I hurried through the sliding glass doors, clutching my leather purse. Marcus stayed in the car, keeping the engine running. The scent of roasted chicken and floor wax filled the air. I reached the teller and pushed my identification through the slot. My pulse thundered in my ears as she typed. "I need a cashier's check for the full balance," I said. My voice was steady, but my fingers were ice cold. The teller looked at the screen and then back at me. She frowned, her head tilting slightly to the right. My stomach twisted into a hard knot of dread. I looked over my shoulder at the entrance. Julian's black SUV was not there yet. The teller finally started printing the documents. I felt a brief moment of relief. Then, the printer jammed with a mechanical screech. The teller groaned and stood up to clear the paper path. Every second felt like an hour in this fluorescent purgatory. I looked at the clock on the wall. Julian had likely called every major bank in the county by now. I checked my phone and saw 3 missed calls from an unknown number. The teller returned with a thick envelope and a sympathetic smile. I had the money. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed with a text message from an anonymous source. It was a photo of the industrial office I had just fled. The image showed Julian holding the master server I thought I had wiped. My blood ran cold at the sight of the blue casing. I had pulled the drive, but the motherboard held a backup chip. My husband had installed it as a redundancy. Julian now had my entire private client list. I pushed through the exit and practically fell into the passenger seat. Marcus didn't wait for me to buckle up. He peeled away from the curb, tires screeching against the asphalt. "We have the cash," I whispered, holding the envelope tight. But Marcus looked grimmer than before. He handed me his phone, showing a new court filing. Julian wasn't just freezing my money anymore. He was accusing me of grand larceny and industrial espionage. The highway ahead was blocked by a sea of red brake lights. A sudden accident had brought the afternoon traffic to a dead halt. We were trapped in a metal cage on the elevated bridge. I looked at the rearview mirror and saw a familiar black SUV 3 cars back. Julian wasn't screaming this time. He was sitting perfectly still, staring at us through the windshield. He had tipped off the highway patrol. The sirens were getting closer. The siren wail sliced through the humid air of the bridge. Marcus gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned bone white. My objective was narrow and desperate. I had to ditch the digital evidence before the patrol car reached our window. I looked at the master drive in my lap, and then at the concrete barrier. Julian's SUV sat 3 car lengths back like a hungry shark in shallow water. He was filming us with his phone. The trap was perfectly set. I rolled down the passenger window. The wind smelled of exhaust and hot rubber. My fingers brushed the smooth plastic of the hard drive. If the police found this, Julian's larceny charge would stick. I needed a distraction to hide the toss. A highway patrolman stepped out of his cruiser and began walking toward us. He adjusted his belt and looked stern. Julian opened his door and pointed at me. He was shouting about a thief and a stolen server. Suddenly, a heavy truck in the adjacent lane blew a tire with a deafening crack. The sound echoed like a gunshot against the bridge girders. Traffic flinched, and the patrolman instinctively ducked toward his car. I used that second of chaos to flick the drive toward the river below. It vanished into the gray soup of the water without a splash. My heart hammered against my ribs as I closed the window. I turned to Marcus and nodded once. The evidence was gone. The officer reached our car and tapped the glass with a heavy flashlight. I lowered the window and forced a polite, grieving smile. He asked for our registration and licenses. Julian scrambled up to the side of our car, breathless and frantic. He told the officer I had a stolen motherboard in my purse. I sat perfectly still as the officer looked at my empty hands. I offered my bag for a voluntary search. Julian's face twisted in confusion as the officer found nothing. The officer checked our IDs and frowned at Julian. He told the heir to return to his vehicle immediately. "This is a civil matter, sir," the officer stated firmly. Julian tried to argue, but the law was not interested in his tantrums. Marcus took a slow, deep breath as the officer handed back our cards. The traffic ahead finally began to crawl forward. We were moving again, leaving Julian stranded on the bridge. He looked absolutely defeated in the rearview mirror. We pulled off the highway at the first available exit. Marcus found a quiet parking lot behind a shuttered diner. He looked at me with newfound respect. "The drive is gone. But he still has that motherboard backup," he warned. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of green circuit. I had snapped it off before the window shattered at the office. Julian had a backup board, but the vital encryption chip was right here. He had nothing. I felt a surge of cold victory. Then my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was not Julian this time. It was my late husband's private cell phone. The screen showed a single photo of a young boy I did not recognize. The boy was standing in front of my own childhood home. The caption was a date from 20 years ago. My husband had a second family I never knew about. A new heir had just entered the deadly game. The image on the screen felt like a physical blow to my chest. Marcus stared at the boy in the photo, his mouth slightly open in shock. My objective was suddenly a shifting target in the dark. I needed to verify the location of this mystery child before the siblings found him. If Julian discovered a secret heir, he would use the boy to invalidate the entire probate process. The car felt smaller as the air grew thin. My husband's ghost was finally speaking from the grave. He was a liar. I scrolled through the metadata of the message with trembling thumbs. The coordinates pointed to a small town 3 hours north of the refinery site. Marcus shifted the car into gear and pulled onto the road. He stayed quiet, respecting the sudden wall of ice I had built. The sensory world narrowed to the hum of the tires and the blue glow of the phone. I looked at the encryption chip in my pocket. It felt heavy and cold. Realized the business wasn't just a refinery. It was a massive child support engine. The highway stretched out into a dark ribbon of asphalt and pine trees. My mind raced through the financial ledgers I had spent years balancing for Robert. I remembered a monthly payment labeled as a property tax for a non-existent warehouse. It was the exact amount needed to maintain a quiet, suburban life for a child. Robert had hidden his life with a surgeon's precision. I had been the unwitting accomplice in my own betrayal. The tension in my gut tightened. Someone else knew this secret, and they were watching me. We reached the outskirts of the town as the sun began to dip. The house in the photo was a modest ranch with peeling white paint. I stepped out of the car and felt the gravel crunch under my heels. A red bicycle lay forgotten on the front lawn. It was a domestic scene that felt alien and threatening. Marcus stayed by the car, his hand resting near his hip. He looked like a man expecting a fight. I walked toward the front door with a heavy, leaden heart. I knocked 3 times on the weathered wood. A woman with tired eyes and graying hair opened the door. She wore an old cardigan and held a kitchen towel. She didn't ask who I was or what I wanted. She simply stepped back to let me inside the dim hallway. The smell of cinnamon and wood smoke filled the house. A small boy sat at the kitchen table, drawing a picture of a boat. He had Robert's jawline and my husband's intense, focused eyes. The truth was undeniable. "He told me you would come eventually," the woman said softly. She sat across from the boy and stroked his hair. I felt a surge of rage, but it vanished into a hollow ache. She wasn't an enemy. She was another casualty of Robert's complex games. She explained that the payments had stopped the day the siblings took the business. Julian's greed was already starving his own brother. The power balance shifted again. I had a new, innocent reason to fight. I wasn't just surviving, I was protecting. I looked at the boy's drawing of the yacht. It was the same vessel Julian had just inherited along with the debt. Robert had promised this boy the boat as a legacy. He had promised everyone things that didn't belong to him. I realized the one sentence. In the courtroom was just the first domino. The entire estate was built on a foundation of sand and lies. I needed to move them before Julian sent his goons. The pressure to act was a crushing weight. Time was running out for us. Suddenly, a set of headlights swept across the living room walls. A car had pulled into the driveway behind Marcus. I moved to the window and pulled the curtain back an inch. It wasn't the police or the EPA agents. It was a white sedan with tinted windows. A man in a dark suit stepped out and adjusted his tie. He held a legal envelope in his gloved hand. He didn't look like a lawyer or a process server. He looked like a professional cleaner, not a janitor, but the kind of man hired to erase human problems quietly. He walked toward the door. The man didn't knock. He simply tried the handle. Marcus moved to intercept him, but the man held up a hand. "I'm here to collect the primary asset," he stated. His voice was as cold as a winter morning. I realized he wasn't talking about the boy or the house. He looked directly at me through the glass of the door. He held up a second photo of the encryption chip. I had the only key to a hidden offshore account. Robert had left the boy's future inside my own pocket. I stood between the boy and the door as Marcus stepped onto the porch. My objective was clear and immediate. I had to protect the child and the encryption chip at any cost. The man in the dark suit didn't flinch as Marcus blocked his path. He seemed more like a machine than a person. I felt the cold plastic of the chip biting into my palm. The woman behind me pulled the boy into the kitchen. Her breathing was ragged and shallow. We were trapped. The stranger tapped the legal envelope against his gloved knuckles. "The offshore funds belong to the firm's creditors now," he said. His voice was flat and lacked any human warmth. He wasn't working for Julian or the heirs. He was an operative for the international bank that held Robert's secret loans. My husband hadn't just lied to his family. He had stolen from people who didn't use courtrooms to settle debts. The pressure in the room became a physical weight. Realized we were all expendable. Marcus didn't back down from the threshold. He reached for the man's lapel, but the stranger moved with predatory speed. A flash of silver light glinted in the dim hallway. Marcus groaned as he was shoved roughly against the white siding. I surged forward and grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the entry table. My fear had finally transformed into a sharp, jagged edge of fury. I wouldn't let this predator touch the child. I swung the lamp with everything I had. The base of the lamp connected with the man's shoulder with a dull thud. He grunted and stumbled back into the gravel of the driveway. Marcus used the opening to scramble back to his feet. He looked dazed, but his eyes were fixed on the suit. I slammed the door and turned the heavy deadbolt. The woman in the kitchen was weeping silently now, I realized the boy was staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. He saw the violence in my face. "Get in the basement," I whispered to the woman. She didn't hesitate and pulled the boy toward the narrow wooden stairs. I turned back to the window to watch the struggle outside. The stranger was unfazed by the blow to his shoulder. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, black device. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a signal jammer. My phone screen went dark instantly. We were cut off from the rest of the world. A sudden realization struck me as I watched the man scan the house. He wasn't looking for the chip anymore. He was looking for the boy's mother. She held the legal identity needed to access the final biometric lock. The encryption chip in my pocket was only half of the key. Robert had split the access between his wife and his mistress. He had ensured we would have to work together to survive. It was his final, cruel joke. I felt sick. I ran to the basement door and descended the creaking steps. The air smelled of damp earth and old cardboard boxes. I found them hiding behind a rusted furnace in the corner. I showed the woman the jagged encryption chip in my hand. "We have to leave now," I told her firmly. She looked at the chip and then at her son. She reached into her cardigan and pulled out a matching silver locket. It was the biometric sensor. We had the whole key. The sound of shattering glass erupted from the floor above us. The stranger had bypassed Marcus and entered through the living room window. His boots crunched on the floorboards with terrifying deliberate pace. I looked around the basement for another way out of the trap. I spotted a small cold chute near the ceiling. It was narrow and filled with cobwebs. It was our only chance to reach the car. I boosted the boy up toward the dark opening. The woman followed, her son through the chute with frantic movements. I heard the basement door at the top of the stairs groan. The stranger was trying to force the wood with a crowbar. I scrambled up the wall and pulled myself into the narrow tunnel. The soot stained my suit and filled my lungs with grit. I tumbled out into the cold grass behind the house. Marcus was already there, holding a tire iron. He looked like he had been through a war. We ran for the car as the stranger emerged from the side of the ranch. He raised the black device again and the car's alarm began to scream. The electronics were haywire, and the engine wouldn't turn over until I held the combined key to the dash. I gripped the silver locket and the green chip together. Suddenly, the car's dashboard flashed a bright, neon green. The biometric sensor had overridden the jammer's signal. The engine roared to life with a violent shake. Julian's black SUV was already blocking the road, with the stranger in the suit closing the gap from behind, locking us in a deadly pincer trap. The car engine roared as Julian's SUV swerved to block the gravel path. I gripped the silver locket and the green chip until my knuckles turned white. My objective was simple. I had to merge these two pieces of Robert's legacy to unlock the truth. Julian stepped out of his vehicle with a frantic look. He held a heavy wrench like a weapon. The boy whimpered in the back seat as the shadow of the tall man loomed over us. Julian slammed his tool against our windshield, spidering the glass. I realized he wasn't looking for money anymore. He was driven by a pure, jealous rage. "Give me the code, Cheyenne," he screamed. I didn't answer him. Instead, I pressed the jagged chip into the locket's hidden groove. A soft chime echoed through the car's speakers. The dashboard display changed from red to a calm, steady blue as the biometric sensor embedded in the dash finally recognized the combined key from the locket and the chip. The encryption was lifting its heavy veil. A map appeared on the screen, showing a small coastal town. It wasn't the refinery or the house. It was the location of Robert's final, hidden trust. I shifted the car into drive and floored the pedal. We surged forward, clipping the edge of Julian's bumper. He spun out into the muddy ditch with a loud metallic crunch. Marcus cheered, but my eyes remained on the GPS. The path was clear, yet the blue light felt cold. We drove for hours until the scent of salt air filled the vents. The GPS led us to a weathered boat slip at the edge of the world. A sleek, white yacht bobbed in the water. It was the vessel Julian thought he had lost to debt. I stepped onto the dock and scanned the biometric pad near the cabin door. The locket worked perfectly. The door slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. Inside, the cabin was filled with rows of black server racks. This wasn't a pleasure boat. It was a mobile data center. Robert had moved the company's real assets to the sea. Julian had inherited the empty buildings and the massive environmental fines. I had inherited the true engine of the family wealth. I looked at the boy's mother and saw a spark of hope. We were finally safe from the bank's silent cleaners. I sat at the main console and began the transfer. The $40 million in debt would remain with the legal heirs. The liquid assets were now moving into a trust for the boy. I felt the lie finally transform into a quiet truth. I had given the greedy heirs exactly what they wanted. They had the name and the ruin. I turned to Marcus, but he was staring at the radar. A new fleet was approaching, but this time, the markings were Coastal Guard, not creditors.